Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Fluffenhammer Adjacent. It's been a while since we've done one of these. Been a while since we've done anything on the Exaggerated Elegy channel. To be perfectly honest, I've been very busy and also just profoundly lacking in energy, given, well, stuff, the state of things. We'll talk about that somewhere else, maybe in Strange Playgrounds or something like that. For here, we're going to be talking about hobby stuff. We're going to be talking about Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000, fun stuff, like the grim, dark, dystopian, theocratic, fascist nightmare future where humanity is scattered and exists in various autocratic, oligarchical, theocratic nightmare states and is preyed upon by evil aliens and by extra dimensional demonic entities that want to eat its collective soul. But the fun stuff, the fun stuff. You know what? It kind of sounds good to me. You know, I would I'm at the point now where I would sort of throw open the doors to the Lovecraftian, to the eldritch cosmic horror and revelation, in favor of what we have now. This is for Strange Playgrounds. This is a discussion for Strange Playgrounds. So we'll take that over there, maybe a little bit later. If you see a Strange Playgrounds episode pop up alongside this or sort of around the same time as this, then you know where this discussion went. What I really want to talk to you about here and now is one of my favorite elements of Warhammer 40,000, one of my favorite Xenos factions, which I don't dabble in as much as obviously the Chaos factions. They are my principal love. I love pretty much everything to do with Chaos, really. It's my jam. I particularly like Nurgle and Slaanesh. Slaanesh in particular. Not just for the obvious reasons either, but I'm sure we've discussed that at some point. Dionysian gods, Dionysian entities. I'm very much that way inclined. I'm more Dionysian than I am Apollonian. I mean, that's one of the interesting dynamics you've got in Chaos. You've got like the ultimate Dionysian god, which is Slaanesh, and in many respects, the ultimate Apollonian god, which is Khorne. We'll discuss that at another time as well. I want to talk to you about the Eldari, or the Eldar as they once were. The reason they changed the name, and it's a good reason, really, is, Eldar was a term coined by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's one of the many collective terms for what people call the elves, the old ones, the elder people, and way back when, way, even before I started in the hobby, which bloody hell, I'm ancient now. That was a long time ago. I started in second ed when the Eldar, as they were back then, had just gotten their first codex and had really been like fleshed out as a race and as a culture and as a force in the game. In Rogue Trader, the Eldar, I mean, in the very earliest iterations of what would come to be called the Eldar, they were just called space elves. In the orcs were called space orcs. This was back when they were trying to decide what went into Rogue Trader Warhammer 40,000, and they were just taking everything from everywhere. So there were bits of 2000 AD, there were bits of Michael Moorcock, there were bits of science fiction authors, there were bits of Doctor Who, there were bits of this and that, and all sorts of stuff just thrown in. And one of the things they did was they looked at fantasy literature. They looked at J.R.R. Tolkien. They looked at all of the great fantasy authors, and they just took bits and for Warhammer 40,000, they just shoved fantasy races into a science fiction setting. So the earliest iterations of the Eldar they were just called space elves, and they were very different from how they are now. Back then, most of the races, the technology and the weapons and the equipment they used came from a common pool. So you could have the weirdest stuff. You had Imperial jet bikes, you had one of the weirdest things you'll ever see in one of the old white dwarfs. There's a Golden Demon entry that is a Harlequin Land Raider. I'm not even kidding. It's legendary. Absolutely legendary. And the Eldar, the Eldar, not even the Eldar at that point, the space elves, they had things like, they had all the stuff that Imperials or Chaos could have. It wasn't really until much later on when all the races started to get their own books and their own army lists that they got bespoke equipment. Starting with things like Lost and the Damned for Chaos, Here We Go for the Orcs, etc., etc. But it really wasn't until, and the Eldar themselves, I mean, the notion of the craft worlds, for example, that wasn't really around at the beginning. They were all these sort of like, what came to be called the Corsairs, the piratical Eldar, which we have now established in the army list and in the model range. That's what they all were back then. They were the remnants of a dead race, a pretty much dead race. They were space pirates. They would fly around in their ships and they would attack like shipping lanes and whatnot and take whatever they could. That was their character back then. They were very, 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 very different from how they would come to be in Second Ed. It was really, I mean, there was a lot of development in White Dwarf articles as well. I like a lot of stuff in that era. In like the interim between Rogue Trader and second edition Warhammer 40,000, there was a lot of development in the pages of White Dwarf and in other publications and articles. So you started to get the development of things like the Harlequins, for example. They came out around this period. The Aspect Warriors started to appear around this period, and they started to develop the background for what we would come to call the Agiani. Those are the Eldar that escaped the fall of their race in the craft worlds. The notion of the Agiani was, I mean, that wouldn't come about for, oh my god, when did they start being called the Agiani? It wasn't until about fourth, fifth edition, I don't think. They were just all collectively called the Eldar up until that point. You didn't really have the distinction. You had the Dark Eldar that came in third ed, obviously. The Exodites. The Exodites didn't come in until second ed. But the second ed codex, the second ed Eldar codex, which was one of the earliest books published for Warhammer 40,000. I think it was the third book. You had the Space Wolves was the very first codex in Warhammer 40,000 ever was Codex Space Wolves. Then I think you had Codex Orcs, I believe, and then it was Codex Eldar. So these, I mean, like, Orcs and Eldar got a codex before your mainstream Space Marines did. That didn't come until later. That was Codex Ultramarines back then. That was the core Space Marine Codex. And then you had offshoots like Codex Angels of Death that had the Blood Angels and Dark Angels in it. It was a weird time. It was a really weird time. But what Codex Eldar did, the second ed, that was my introduction to Warhammer 40,000, by the way. That was the very first book I had, the very first codex I ever bought, and I loved it to bits. I read that book because I was like 8 at the time, I think. Maybe not even that old, 7, 8. I read that book until it literally fell apart. It was my introduction into the sort of grim darkness of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and I was just enraptured by it. This alien race with their mythicism, their mythic cycles, their own cultures, which are derived from all over the place, by the way. I mean, it's at this point that you get established the Elder Mythic cycle with their gods, which are derived from all over the shop. They're primarily derived from ancient Greek archetypes. You've got their like Hephaestus equivalent and their Zeus equivalent, which is Azuyan, and so on and so forth. But there's also like they've got their Mars equivalent, which is obviously Keylamensh Arcane, the bloody-handed god. But there are other little elements as well, like aesthetically, they came to have a lot of influence from Shintoism and Buddhism and sort of like Eastern cultures, which is really, really cool as well. And a lot of that is ingrained in their culture. This is where you get established the notion of the elder path, where in order to stave off the extremes that the Eldar psyche is capable of inhabiting, the Agiani, the craft world Eldar, dedicate themselves to particular paths, which are like they're like crafts effectively. So that's part of the pun, by the way. They're called craft worlds not only because they are giants like planetary spacecraft, but also because they are cultures of various crafts. So what an Eldar does is they will dedicate themselves to particular paths of life. So they may be an artisan, or they may be an actor, or they may be a dancer, or a whatever, a cook even, or something like that, like domestic. And they will dedicate themselves to that path until they have mastered it. They will do nothing else. But not only will they not do anything else, they will identify. Their entire identity becomes subsumed by that path, and they become part of it until they've completed it. Then they move on to something else and they master another path, and so on and so forth. And they can actually get lost on the paths. That's what's really interesting. They can come to dedicate themselves so utterly to a particular craft that they lose themselves in it and they can never step away from it again. When when they're in their domestic lives, the Eldar can take off the role or of the path that they're dedicated to and be as they are, be just domestic, be whatever a normal Eldar is in the craft worlds, in their culture, in their society. But for a lot of Eldar, that doesn't happen. They dedicate, they become so obsessive and they identify to such an extreme that they become subsumed within the tradition of their craft and they can never leave it again. Everything else bleeds away. This particularly happens with the warrior aspects, the temples, the shrines dedicated to the warrior aspects, which are the aspect warriors you find in the codexes in the game. It's very easy for an Eldar to get lost on those paths, and those become the exarchs of those paths, like the high priests. They can never leave that path again. You have explained in that book the fall of the Eldar, how they became so powerful and so contented and so corrupted at the height of their culture with their own self-satisfaction, that they gave birth to Slaanesh. Slaanesh was born in this. The way it's described in the second ed codex is brilliant. Slaanesh is born like a rupture in reality. The birth of Slaanesh echoes throughout creation, time and creation, and it creates the Eye of Terror. It rips reality open. The power of Slaanesh, the hunger, the need, the desire bills through the bodies and minds of the Eldar and consumes their souls utterly to fuel Slaanesh's birth, and that creates the Eye of Terror. Only those that escaped on some of the craft worlds survived, and those that were shielded in the webway, so the Drukhari, the Harlequins, etc., etc. But even some of them, they were drawn into the Eye of Terror and consumed by Slaanesh. But from that point on, the Eldar's soul was condemned to be consumed by Slaanesh. And as a result, the various different offshoots have found different ways of overcoming that. So the Eldar of the craft worlds have created a thing called the Infinity Circuit, which is like this. It's circuitry that runs throughout the entire craft world, but it's not like circuitry as we understand it. It's these crystalline organic structures that are more like the roots of a plant or a fungus, and they bind every element of the craft world together. And Eldar wear these psychically resonant stones on their bodies called spirit stones. And when they die, their soul is captured by the spirit stone. And if that stone is recovered, then it can be placed in the infinity circuit, and their soul becomes part of the collective energies of that infinity circuit. So they live on. They actually live on in this kind of twilight afterlife. If an Eldar dies and their spirit stone is broken or not recovered, then it can be consumed by Slaanesh. If they die without a spirit stone, then their souls are automatically drawn into the warp and consumed by Slaanesh. They actually call Slaanesh in their mythology she who thirsts. And Slaanesh, at the point of their birth, also destroyed most of their gods as well, consumed them utterly. The only surviving ones are Kegarak, the laughing god, god of the Harlequins, who exists in the webway apparently. Technically, Iniad kind of survived, the god of the dead, although Iniad is in a kind of twilight state. They're not quite reborn yet. And also, in a way, Keelan Mensch Arcane, the god of war and blood and violence and murder, the darker aspect of the Eldari psyche, Cain survived by fighting against Slaanesh and was apparently shattered into various different shards that came to rest at the hearts of the craft worlds. And that's what the avatars of Cain are. The avatars of Cain are effectively living shards of Kila Menshar Cain, the war god. They are manifestations of the darker side of the Eldari psyche that can take things like violence and warfare and hatred and anger to the same extremes as any other emotion or craft or state of mind. I love all this stuff. This was all established in the Second Ed Codex, and it removed them so far from what they were before. Because really, before that, they were just another kind of humanoid race. They were not much different from the elves that they originally were, the space elves that they originally were. The Second Ed Codex made them really alien, very interesting, and for me, absolutely fascinating. I've loved them ever since. They were my first army. They were my very, very first army. My first miniature, barring the stuff from Hero Quest, was the Eldar War Walker from that era, which is a very goofy looking thing now. It was made of lead back then, if you can imagine. And it was a bitch to put together, it was a bitch to paint, but it was my favorite thing in the world. I loved that so much. And eventually I got a whole Eldar army. They were my favorites. I remember I had the original model for Eldrad Ulthron, the Farseer. I had most of the Phoenix Lords. I had swooping hawks and fire dragons and striking scorpions. I had the old Harlequins. I had loads of stuff. I had a dreadnought, you know. I had loads of stuff for that army, and it was really fun. That was what I cut my teeth with back then. And I obviously since then I've moved on. When the Second Ed Chaos Codex came out, things changed quite dramatically. I just fell in love with everything about Chaos. The extremity of it, the ridiculous horror of it just drew me in, and I became wholly dedicated to the powers of Chaos. But I've always kept up with the Eldar, especially when something has changed, especially when things have been different. I mean, I've got every Eldar slash Eldari codex that's ever been published, including that little Eldar Craft Worlds pamphlet that was a supplement for the Third Ed Codex. I've got that somewhere. So in Third Ed, when everything changed, you had little things just moving on. You had like the establishment of the characters of the craft worlds. You also had, of course, the really serious separation of the Eldar and the Dark Eldar as they were back then, because the Dark Eldar were the new race for third edition. They were a bit underdeveloped, and because that was when they were introduced. They weren't quite as interesting as they became later, but that's where you got that distinction, and it was really fascinating. Fast forwards, oh God, a long way. Fast forward quite a long way, and you have things like the introduction of the Inari, that subcult of the Eldar. First of all, you have the renaming of them as Eldari, which I actually like better than Eldar. I know there's a lot of purists out there who really don't like it. I like the renaming. I think Eldari sounds a lot better myself. Also, it does that thing of removing them from Tolkien's elves, which I kind of like anyway. Excuse me. I mean, the way they've got around it in background terms, in lore terms, is they've just said that they still use the term Eldar sometimes, but they've just said that Eldar is it's a mistranslation. It's a human imperial mistranslation of what they call themselves. It's just like humanity getting it wrong, effectively, which is kind of a neat little explanation, I've got to say. So you had the renaming of them as the Eldari, and you had the distinction between the Azhiyani, the Craftworld Eldar, the children of Azhiyan, the the sort of Zeus father, patriarchal god figure of the Eldar mythic cycles, and you have the Drukhari, or the Dark Elder, and we'll talk about them at another time. I love the Dark Elder too, by the way, the Drukhari. Really love them. We'll talk about them in another video because they warrant a video or a discussion of their own. And that served to emphasize the character of the Azhiyani, of the Eldari, even more. And since then, they've just like developed and developed and developed. They've added in new things, they've introduced new elements. So, one of the things they did in Second Ed to make sure that players could still play with their old Rogue Trader sets, their sort of piratical sets, was they introduced the notion of the Elder Pirates, the outcasts, those that don't belong to any craft world or path or culture, and who they operate like the Rogue Trader space elves. They're pirates. They occupy like space lanes. They're nomadic. They prey on shipping lanes and other races, and they only care about themselves. You could play those in the Second Ed Codex. They had like a whole entry for piratical Eldar. They became, on the one hand, they became the Dark Eldar. They became the Drukhari, but more recently, they actually became the Reavers. They introduced them back into the Agiani and the Drukhari. They're one of those weird sort of crossovers between the Agiani, the Corsairs, the Void Reavers, and the Void Scarred, who are sort of like this motley crew who are derived from all over Eldar culture. That's they're ex Harlequins, they're ex Craftworlders, they're ex Drukhari, they're ex Inari, all come together under a common banner. And they are like these really flamboyant pirates and reavers, and they're very theatrical. They're lovely. They're really, really cool. If you want to play a slightly more scurvy type of Eldar or Eldari, there, but without dipping into the absolute utter fucking Clive Barkerian horror of the Drukhari, they're the way to go. You've got the Harlequins. The Harlequins have been around not from the beginning, but for a long, long time, almost from the very beginning. And the Harlequins are a really interesting element. I've always loved the Harlequins. If I was going to collect an Eldari army today, it would probably be Harlequins primarily. The Harlequins are an offshoot of the Eldari race who exist in a sort of synthetic other dimension called the Webway. And the Webway is this incredibly huge, complex structure of pan-galactic tunnels that burrow through reality. It used to be the case that the Eldari created it. I don't know if that's still the case. I don't think it is. I think now they've rewritten that. So the old ones, like one of the oldest sentient races in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, created the Webway. I think that's the case now. But the Eldar kind of occupy it and utilize it most frequently. So there are like entire craft worlds, then cultures that exist inside the webway, away from the material universe. Comora, the city of the Drukhari, the Dark Elder, exists in the webway. But the Harlequins also inhabit the webway. And they are what it says on the tin. They are like, if you think of harlequins, i.e., clowns from our own cultures, that's what they are. They are theatre troupes and dancers and players and acrobats. They're a circus, they're a kind of circus. But they are also the Eldari who keep alive the mythic cycles of the Eldari race. You know how I was talking about earlier, there's the Eldar path. So they dedicate themselves entirely to particular roles. The troops of the Harlequins do exactly that. They take on roles in not only in the performances that they give, but in their lives, in everything they do, that they inhabit to the nth degree. To the point whereby the Eldar lose themselves in the role and actually effectively become the characters they're playing. They become subsumed by it. And they also incorporate their enemies into it. So when the Harlequins fight, they're not fighting, they're giving a performance, and they are rewriting what's going on around them so that their enemies take on roles within whatever story they're trying to tell or whatever story they're living. It's absolutely brilliant, really, really wonderful. And there are different Harlequin, like, what are they called? I think they're just called groups, aren't they? That have different aesthetics and different philosophies and who have responsibility for keeping alive certain Eldari mythic traditions. I love that. I absolutely love that. And their god is Kegarak. Their god is Kegarak, the laughing god, the god of tricks, who is the ultimate Harlequin, the grand Harlequin, who keeps playing jokes on Slanesh apparently, which Slanesh doesn't like by all accounts, does not like at all. Love it. Absolutely love it. As I mentioned earlier, you have the Inari. one of the most recent and interesting offshoots of the Eldari. The Inari are a cult. They're a subcult within Eldari culture that are derived from all over. They come from the craft worlds, they come from the Harlequins, they come from the Aspect Warriors, they come from the Drakari, the Exodites, all over, all over. And they are dedicated to the idea. They don't just want to survive like the other remnants of the Eldari race. They're not interested in that. They want to destroy Slaanesh. They think that there will never be peace for the Eldari race until Slaanesh is destroyed. And they think that the way of doing that is by resurrecting the Eldar god of the dead, Iniad. And that mythically that makes sense. What is Slaanesh? Slaanesh is the erotic impulse made manifest. Slaanesh is Eros, yeah? Eros, Dionysus, Aphrodite, all of the Dionysian gods, all of the impulse, the obsession, the passion, the inspiration, the poetry, the life force, the libido, that's Slaanesh taken to utmost extremes and without any parameters. Iniad is the opposite. Iniad is Thanatos, death, decay, the end of things, right? The ultimate end of things. And Iniad is a sleeping god, a pupating god at the moment. The Inari are a subcult who believe that in order to wake Iniad, to arouse Iniad, the Eldari race needs to collectively die to fuel that rebirth. So they are this weird, morbid, almost extinctionist cult within the Eldari, and they're very complex. They are very complex because they are right. They are. It's so strange. They are correct in one way. Iniad does exist, like a lot of gods in the Warhammer 40,000 metaphysics. Iniad exists and is sleeping and probably could be roused by the mass death of the Eldari race. Whether that would actually succeed in destroying Slaanesh is up for debate. And so they're very contentious because they are a fundamentalist cult. They're extinctionist and their message is very extreme. A lot of figures within Eldari society don't like them, really don't like them. Like Asdrabale Vect, who is the Lord of Comora, hates them, absolutely hates them, wants them destroyed. Eldrad Ulthron, the Farseer of the craft world Ulthwé, who was once regarded as one of the great saviors of his race, originally was with the Inari, to the point whereby he committed atrocities alongside them and was expelled from his craft world. But more recently, certainly with the 10th ed Eldari Codex, which is the latest one, that has changed somewhat. The Inari are losing support because they are so fundamentalist and because they're nihilistic ultimately. Their whole path is one of nihilism. They don't believe there's a future, a living future for the Eldari race. They believe that the only purpose for the Eldari now is death, is mass extinction, and in doing so, to undo the mistake of Slaanesh. It's all very contentious, and they're not well liked, I can tell you. Very interesting though. But in game terms, the Eldar have always been really interesting. They've always been a bit of a glass cannon. They are very, 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 very offensively powerful. Their firepower and their technology is beyond anything like humanity can bring to bear. It's ridiculous. They're one of the long range armies. But they also have specialist units. They are an army that's always worked best with someone who likes to play tactically, who sees the game as a kind of puzzle where each unit supports the other, because no one Eldari unit has ever been able to do things on its own. You need to use the way the army interlocks and synchronizes together to support itself in order to get the best out of it. They've often had problems, the game developers, balancing the Eldar or the Eldari. They tend to be killer, as they have been really right up until 10th edition. And at the beginning of 10th edition, with their index, they were really killer. They introduced a special rule for their index army list, which was the get you by army list at the beginning of the edition, um, where basically you could you could replace dice rolls. I mean, one of the things the Eldari do is they read the strands of fate. Their Farseers, their leaders, their psychic leaders, guide the Eldari race by casting the runes effectively. They read the various skeins of the future and they try to direct the Eldari race along the one that's best for them, effectively. And the way they represented this was they gave them an army-wide special rule, which I believe was called Battle Fortune or something like that. And effectively, what it enabled you to do was roll a number of dice at the beginning of the game, and you could replace dice rolls during the course of the game with those rolls. It's not a very good mechanic. It overbalances the game. A game system that's based on dice rolls, where you have a mechanic that allows you to replace the rolls that you make, is effectively like cheating, but within purview of the rules, you know? It just doesn't work. It overbalances the game ridiculously. And we saw that at the beginning of 10th Ed with their index because they were just at the top. They've been consistently at the top of all the leaderboards since the beginning of 10th Ed. The new Eldari Codex has changed that, and I'm really happy about it. I'm really happy about it. Their army-wide special rule is still here. You know, they haven't gotten rid of it. They've just changed the way it works. It's battle focused now. And effectively, the way it works is you have battle focus tokens at the beginning of any battle depending on the size of it. So incursion battles it's 2, strike forces it's 4, onslaughts it's 6. Those are the various sizes of game is in Warhammer 40,000. And basically, you can spend those tokens every turn to unlock universal special rules for your units. Way better. Way, 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 way better. It works so much better. It's still very powerful. It's still a really, really good, versatile army-wide special rule. In fact, one of the better ones, I would say. And the variety of maneuvers you can unlock when you use it, when you use your battle focus tokens. Yeah, there's just loads of there's loads you can do. Most of it is based on the maneuverability of the Eldari, which again is very characterful because that's the way they work. They're fast, they rely on stealth and speed more than anything, more than sort of might to get them through. I really like that. Having read through the codex, actually, I think this may be one of the best codices in 10th Ed. In terms of the way it works, everything has a place, everything has a purpose, everything locks together really beautifully. All of the various detachments are really characterful, and I can see why you would use any one of them. They are really, really fun. I like the whole codex, I've got to say. This is something that's happened throughout 10th Ed, I've got to say. There have been one or two that aren't quite as good as the others, like the Custodes aren't quite as good as the others. But by and large, I've been really impressed with the 10th Ed codices, and I think this might be one of the best Eldari codices we've had for a long time because it's a bit more balanced than what we've had. Ninth and 8th edition and 7th edition, they were really they were overbalanced. They were really powerful. They were like ridiculously powerful, the Eldari. This is a bit more, I don't want to say tame or toned down because that makes it sound like it's dull. It's not. It's really fun. It's really characterful. You can put together some really fun, interesting armies from this list, but it's not as ridiculously, overwhelmingly powerful from the get-go. It doesn't overbalance things in the way that they used to. And I'm really pleased. I'm really, really pleased. It's a great read, this one. I've really enjoyed going through it. There's a lot of new stuff. They moved the story of the Eldari on a little bit, like the positioning of the Inari is a bit different now. Eldrad moving away from the Inari and returning back to his craft world, seeking penance, all of that stuff. Yeah, I really, really like it. They're moving things on. We've got, oh my god, one of the best new additions. We finally, each of the warrior aspects has a thing called a Phoenix Lord, and the Phoenix Lords are, they are the very first warriors to establish that particular aspect. They're like ageless, undying warrior priests who are reborn endlessly, to the point whereby they exist within the mythic cycles of the Eldari. And there's been one for every aspect warrior cult in the previous book, all except one. the warp spiders. The warp spiders have been languishing a little bit ever since second ed. They were introduced in second ed, and their models haven't changed since second edition, since I was 8 years old, right up until now, 10th edition, when I'm 41. So now that finally they've got their new models, which is great. But also, they never had a Phoenix Lord. Their Phoenix Lord wasn't even mentioned. However, that's changed. We now have Lycus, the Whispering Web, and she is wonderful. It was worth the wait. It was worth the wait, my love. She is absolutely glorious. Love the model. She's got great background and she is killer. She's very powerful. If you put her in a unit of warp spiders, ooh, yes, it's going to pay off beautifully. One of the more interesting things, one of my favorite classic Phoenix Lords, he is in the Codex. He's got loads of background and everything. Karandras, the Striking Scorpion. But because his model isn't ready yet, he hasn't got any rules in this book to use. My guess is what they'll do. They'll introduce him in a narrative campaign at some point. My hope is it's going to be a narrative campaign against the Drukhari because Dratzhar, the Lord of the Incubi from the Drukhari, there's been a lot of not too subtle suggestion that he is actually Ahra, the original striking scorpion who fell to chaos, who is Karandras's mortal enemy. I hope that happens. I want to see them. I want to see the new Karandras model against the more recent Dratzhar model. I think that would go down very, very well indeed. Really want to see a bit of kin strife, yeah, a bit of kin war going on. Drukhari versus Eldari. It's always lots of fun. Lots of fun. Well, my loves, thank you for listening to me ramble on about the Eldari, the Eldar, the Agiani, the Drukhari, the Harlequins, the Inari, etc., etc. I love these guys. Next to the Chaos Forces, these guys are my favorite. I really, really love the Eldari, and it's nice to see the model range getting loads of love. It really is. It's nice to see things like the Warp Spiders coming back. It's nice to see the Aspect Warriors having all of their new models, the Phoenix Lords having all of their new models. Oh my god. The original Phoenix Lords are some of my favorites in the entire history of Games Workshop, and I love the new models. The updates of them are stunning. My personal favorite, Fuegan, the Fire Dragon Exarch, the Burning Lance as he's called. The new one is so good. I'm gonna have to buy him to paint him up. I really, really am. Well, my loves, until next time, bye bye.